My pleasure this morning to welcome Denise Barth and Shira Rosenblatt, both from the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles. They're going to tell us about a study that was done about Jewish Los Angeles a while back, and also something called the Ezra Network. Rabbi Farkas referred to the study that you'll be hearing about as a portrait of LA's unique Jewish community that will help us chart paths forward as we strive to create the most inclusive, vibrant, and welcoming place for all. Our first speaker is going to be Denise Barth. She joined Federation about a year ago. She's Research and Evaluation Associate for the Federation. She has an MA from University of Chicago in Social Psychology and a PhD from University of Delaware. Shira calls her a tremendous asset, and she'll be joining and be our first part of the speaker, and she'll be talking about the Ezra Network. Shira is the Associate Chief Program Officer at Federation. She oversees research and evaluation. She has a bachelor's from UC Berkeley and cross-cultural child development, and a PhD at UCLA in educational psychology. At Federation, she led the first community study that you'll be hearing about today, the first one in over 25 years, which you can find at studyofjewishla.org. Quick personal note, Shira is the daughter of longtime VBS members, Linda Rosenblatt and her late husband. You'll see Linda sitting here. She just got here. She's in the Quell section. You can find her there. And Shira is a graduate of Heschel Day School. She chanted Torah portions here every Rosh Hashanah till she left home for college. She calls herself a lucky mom to her daughters, and it's a great pleasure to welcome both of them here to VBS this morning. And Denise, I'm going to turn it over to you to start it off.
Thank you so much. All right, hi everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Denise Barth. I'm here today to share about the Jewish Federation's Ezra Network. So the Jewish Federation addresses the greatest challenges of the Jewish community by helping the most vulnerable and ensuring the Jewish future for generations to come. Its values are based on Jewish values, and the Ezra Network follows these values by helping to bridge connections between community members and social service providers. So the network is composed of social service providers from Jewish Family Services, Beit Tzedek, and JVS SoCal, and these organizations employ social workers, lawyers, and counselors. So the Ezra Network is meant to help the community members from all walks of life that are dealing with diverse struggles. And this is incredibly valuable in times of crisis, but also for families who are dealing with other extenuating circumstances or even just day-to-day circumstances. And the message that Ezra sends to community members is that they don't have to go through these problems alone, right? There are resources and people available to help them through their struggles. So how has the Ezra Network flexed itself to respond to crisis over the past years? After 2008, rabbis across Los Angeles were hearing from their congregants about food insecurity, housing insecurity, and the loss of jobs. And rabbis were really doing their best to try to get their congregants connected to social services, but the services were not coordinated among the partners. The Federation stepped up here to help address this problem by creating a one-stop shop for the Jewish community to help them navigate the social services space for support. In recent years as well, Ezra has been pivotal in coordinating efforts between social service providers. In response to the 2018 wildfires, social workers and service providers triaged support in the San Fernando Valley to help assist community members who were displaced or affected in any way by the fires. Again, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Ezra Network providers' services went virtual, and this was to help accommodate the needs and safety of community members. New emergency financial assistance was set up to help provide a quick turnaround and to ensure community members had access to food and other basic needs. And since then, Ezra shifted strategy to focus more on reaching people from more people rather than focusing on specific geographic areas. And currently, most services begin virtually, but they can go in person on a case-by-case basis. This year, Ezra geared up to face rising inflation as well as the end of eviction moratoriums in our city. And today, Ezra provides a lot of in-person and virtual expanded access and services to its community members. So, for example, it covers various types of assistance, whether that be from a social worker, a job counselor, or any sorts of legal advice. Between January and June of this year, over 600 clients were served by the Ezra Network's providers. No clients were turned away, and we really are excited to see this number continue to climb as the end of the year comes nearer and also moving forward. So there are actually several ways to get in contact with Ezra Network providers. There's the general helpline at 855-JFED-HELP. And then there are also direct referral lines for social workers, job counselors, and legal counsel. So if you have a specific need, you can directly access those types of workers. You can also find these numbers on jewishla.org/Ezra. And there are a number of resources and websites listed through that page as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and invite any sorts of questions that you might have about the Ezra Network. Yeah. Yes. That's a great question. Do you know the answer to that, Shira? Mm-hmm. So just to restate what Shira said for those on Zoom, Ezra seems to be a Los Angeles primarily service. Yeah, so the Ezra Network is primarily for a Los Angeles-based Jewish Federation model, but it's going to be a model potentially for other organizations, like other cities as well.
I wondered how it got its name, Ezra.
That's a great question. So Ezra means help in Hebrew. It means help. Mm-hmm. So I don't actually personally know the exact history behind how that was selected, but I think it sort of aligns with the intention behind the network to help people and help its most vulnerable community members. Great.
All right, so Ezra is one of those programs that we are just so proud of because it's truly meeting the needs of people as different kinds of situations evolve. And at the root, it grew out of relationships that we had, but often those particular members are not necessarily sitting around the same table. So that's part of what we do, is to try and convene people and address the greatest challenges. When we created Ezra, and thank you, Denise, when we created Ezra, we did it out of the data that we had from these different organizations and the situations that had arisen that made us know that we needed to do something. But we had no data about the needs throughout the community. And that is because most large Jewish communities do a study of their community every 5 or 10 years. And LA had not done a study since 1997. So as you might imagine, it was a completely different world, and it's a brand new landscape. So when we started to think about actually doing a study a few years ago, we knew that the methodology had to be completely different. When the study was done in 97, everybody called landlines, which I know my mother even gave up. So there are not many people who have landlines, and cell phones don't have, an area code doesn't tell you anything about where people are. So the way in which we had to reach people changed, along with the basic way that we ask about gender. The way that we ask about it now is very different than the way that we asked about it in 1997. So what I'm going to share with you are highlights from this study. The data was collected in 2021, and it provides really wonderful information about a number of different themes. And if I pique your interest at all, you can go to studyofjewishla.org, and you'll see that what we've done is that we've reported on the findings through 10 different lenses. So each report is a different type of different themes. So there's a diversity report and an engagement report and a congregational report. And so after what I share with you today, which are some general highlights, and maybe you read the key findings report, then it's really a choose your own adventure. You could dive into whatever you're interested in. And we are continuing to analyze the data from those surveys, as well as collect other qualitative data to really supplement the numbers with stories from people in our community. And feel free to interrupt as we go, ask questions. That's what makes it fun. So when you go about doing a study like this, you have so many different things that you want to learn, and then you have to narrow it down. So these are pretty basic. When you go to any community study that people have done, they pretty much look at these 3 categories. We did some of it a little bit differently, but the categories are pretty much the same. So one thing that we are always really interested in on behalf of the community is understanding how people understand their Jewish identity and how they engage in the community. And again, the way that we asked those questions in 2021 is really different from the way that we asked them in 1997. And then, of course, to continue to support the vulnerable in our community, we need to understand a lot more about health and mental health and financial situation and all different kinds of services that people need, and the extent to which they reach out to them and what they get in return. And then finally, we want to really understand basic demographics. So geographically, we cover a huge area, and I'll show you a map in a moment. We want to understand people's ages, who's in their households, those kinds of questions. So in 2021, we partnered with Brandeis University, who has done dozens of these community studies by now, and University of Chicago, NORC it's called. And it was really a fabulous dynamic duo in terms of their skill sets. And they employed an address-based sampling. If anyone's interested in the methodology, it's all online, or you could ask me after, but we're not going to go into the details here. But hopefully you can trust that we did our best statistically to make sure that it was as representative of the population as possible, which means that we wanted to make sure that all different kinds of subgroups that we were interested in, whether that be young adults or older adults or families with children or Israelis or Persians or Jewish people of color, we wanted to make sure that we were able to capture enough information about each of those groups. And we got almost 4,000 respondents, and that's the data that I will share with you. So geographically, we cover a massive area. So all the way out to Camarillo in Conejo Valley. On that side, we go to Glendale, we go to the South Bay, we cover the counties, North County, like Simi Valley and Valencia, all of those areas. And we were able to divide the population into 6 different regions. And what you see here is that 75% of our population is basically in these 3 regions. So West Side, West Valley, and Central Metro Mid. And then the rest are kind of scattered about. And what you'll see in the reporting is that we use the geographic lens to understand any patterns in the data. And when there is a notable difference, something significant that stands out, then it's noted in the report. And you'll see there are a lot of places where actually it's not different by region, and sometimes where it is. Okay, so basic size. I've been at Federation almost 11 years, and people always ask, you know, like when we started this large teen initiative, how many teens are there in LA? Nobody knew. I would call the BJE, they would give me a number, and we go, okay, we'll go with that. But now we actually know. So if you think about Jewish individuals across that whole catchment area, you have almost 565,000 Jewish individuals. And that's about 9% more than in 97. This is the only time you'll see me comparing to 97 because of the methodological differences that I noted previously. And then you could see among those almost 565,000, you have about 100,000 Jewish children. What's particularly interesting is the blue 25% on top, because what that tells you is that that's the total people within Jewish households. So even though the number of Jewish people who identify as Jewish, has gone up just 9%, the people who are in those households with at least one Jewish adult has gone up 25%. So that suggests, and then the data backs it up, that there is just tremendous more diversity within our households. And that becomes particularly important, let's say, for Federation programs such as PJ Library, where we send free books to 13,000 children across the city every month, because we need to know that when those books end up on the doorstep, they might be opened by a Jewish parent, they might be opened by a parent who is not Jewish, they might be opened by a child who identifies, you know, as Jewish, a sibling, or a child who doesn't. And so making sure that we are really approaching our work with the lens of the entire family is really crucial for a program like PJ Library. And then we want to look at age. So you could see on the left that we have about 28% of that 100,000 that are 5 and under, and the same amount that are 6 to 12, and then the largest amount, 40%, that are 13 to 17 years of age. And then when you look at the right-hand side, you see the age of Jewish adults. And what stands out is that almost 50% of our population are 55 years and older, which is more than Los Angeles. It's more than the National Pew Study, which was done in 2020. And that's a really critical finding for us to keep in mind for Federation, but of course we did this on behalf of the whole community, for everybody to keep in mind in terms of engagement, in terms of services, health services that might need to be met. And to know, of course, that people are living many more decades than they were previously and living really active lives. So that's a really critical piece and something that I know VBS has a new program here, and those kinds of programs are beginning to surface in different areas because it really had not been addressed fully previously. So another lens that we used is understanding where a household sees themselves in terms of financial security. So as you can imagine, there are tons of different ways to ask this kind of question. The survey that we did not allow us to go in depth in terms of really understanding people's, we asked income, and then there are a lot of people who don't answer that question. We asked about whether people spend more than 30% of their earnings on rent or mortgage, and that number is high in LA. And we asked another question about the whether people could afford an emergency $400 payment. That's our study was basically limited to a few questions like that in terms of hard numbers. But what we did ask is how people perceive their financial situation. And this has actually been validated in a lot of other measures where they collected a lot more data on the dollars, in people's homes, their assets and income. And it aligns really well. So that's the lens that we use in our studies. And what you see here is that 19% of our Jewish households feel that they are barely making it. And then you have 20% who see themselves as well off. Both of those ends of the spectrum are really critical if you think about food insecurity, if you think about affordability of Jewish life for those families who might be really struggling. And we call those families financially struggling in the reports. And then the well-off or extra money is really important, of course, when it comes to philanthropy and other kinds of ways that we might want to connect with people. And what we notice is that the people who end up in this, who reported that they are financially struggling, also have a number of other things that are kind of stacked against them. So when we look at health concerns, when we look at mental health, they have more needs than those people who are not financially struggling. They see Jewish life as less accessible than those who are not financially struggling. So again, it's really the reason why we have something like the Ezra Network, because it's often not just about getting food on your table, but it's also about employment perhaps, and it's also about other aspects, other needs of a family. And it's worthwhile mentioning that within that 19%, you might have people who are not able to put food on the table, or you might have an Orthodox family with 5 children or a traditional family with 5 children who's struggling to keep their children or put their children in Jewish day school, right? Because it's all of their perception. So we have to think about it from all of those multiple lenses. Okay, another fascinating part of this study looked at diversity. And this, I would say, is definitely worth any of you who are interested in looking more deeply at the report, because there are some things we found out that we knew, and some things that, as I've been presenting over the last year, people are a bit more surprised about. So we know that LA is extremely diverse in many ways, and that the Jewish community is very diverse. So what we found is that there are almost 50,000 Russian-speaking Jews. That number might seem a little high to people because we don't see them in our institutions in the proportion that they are in the society. So when you look in our day schools, when you look in our congregations, they're not there in the numbers that you would expect if you just look at how prevalent they are in the broader community. So again, like something for the community to think about in terms of priorities, or what are the ways that Russian-speaking families might want to connect that we potentially are not offering, or we might have some inherent barriers that we may not be aware of in terms of engaging them. And then you see Israelis and Persians, and I'm at Valley Shalom. There are obviously, we see a lot of Israelis and Persians, right? They are very much overrepresented in our day schools, in our congregations, in Jewish life. And so we know that they have a very strong presence in our community. One group that people didn't realize had as much of a presence in terms of numbers are Latino Jews. And I've been thinking about this a lot and working with Jutina, that's a group that focuses on this. And I think part of the reason is that the people who fit within Latino Jews are from dozens of different countries, tons of different narratives. And they don't always know who each other are, because they don't necessarily, if there are Latino Jews in the room, we might not notice in the same way that you might notice some other groups. So that's a really interesting one for us to continue to think about as well. And then there are Jewish people of color. So the way that we chose to identify Jewish people of color is by self-identification. So if they said they were Jewish, and if they answered that they were a person of color, then they were put in Jewish people of color. But the data is all public. So somebody else could go in and they could say, you know what? I want to identify Jewish people of color by everyone who identifies as non-white, or everybody who is from, these countries, or whatever they choose, and they will come up with a different number. Regardless of what number different people come up with, I think what's most important is that there are Jewish people of color all throughout Los Angeles, many of them finding a place in our community and many of them not finding a place in our community. Again, just something really for us to think about when we want to be the most inclusive community possible. And when you go into the diversity report, you'll see that these numbers presented as really flat, but each of these, when you go into the diversity report, you'll see that there's a whole section on Russian-speaking Jews. So it's not just the 48,000 that are on here, but then it's the households where there is a Russian-speaking Jew. And there are all different ways that you'll see a lot of different numbers. So if you go to the Israeli section, you'll see that there are people who have Israeli citizenship and those who don't have Israeli citizenship, and those that live with Israelis and those that have lived in Israel. And you'll come up with all different kinds of numbers. So what I want you to take from this is just the richness of our diversity, regardless of what the actual numbers are, and at times the different ways in which these groups tend to participate in Jewish life. And the final one is LGBTQ. A large part of our population identifies as LGBTQ. And when you look at LGBTQ and Jewish people of color and Israelis also, I think, they tend to be younger, which means that a generation from now, those groups are going to be a larger percentage. So one thing that Denise has been helping us do, and we've been doing together, is looking beyond those 6 regions and looking more within those regions. What are the pockets that we really want to be able to learn more about? So if you're interested in that, we have some other data on that. But this is just a quick look into the West Valley demographics and the number of Jewish adults here and the children. And we are looking at the intermarriage rate or interfaith rate. It's a little bit lower in the West Valley than it is elsewhere around Los Angeles. The general number around Los Angeles is the same as the Pew National 2020 study, about 42%. Okay, so I spoke about different lenses, right? So there's geography, there's diversity. Another lens is health and mental health. And we see that the Jewish community, especially young adults, very much mirror the general community. So when you hear the Surgeon General talking about a crisis in mental health of young adults, know that that's also happening in our community. And what you see is, if you look on the right-hand side on the table, you see huge percentages of 22 to 30-year-olds and 31 to 40-year-olds, between 44 and 47%, who said that they need mental health or substance abuse support. So that's basically 1 out of every 2. And some people say, well, that's because this was done in COVID, this was 2021, everyone was struggling. But the reality is, before COVID, this group was struggling for many years. And COVID just exacerbated it, but it didn't cause it. And we are living in a world where our young adults, many of them are really struggling with mental health challenges. Some of them are getting support, some of them are not. There's a high rate of a sense of loneliness, and that's been something that's been highlighted all around in the general population, and something that we really need to continue to have in our mind. And then if you look at the last bullet on the left-hand side, you'll see what I had mentioned before, that those who are financially struggling report more loneliness than the older ones. And you see that again and again. Again, if you're struggling in one area, you're often struggling in other areas. So another lens that we used in thinking about the community is around Jewish engagement. And what we did is that we asked these 20 behavioral questions. Some of them very traditionally asked over the years, like attending high holiday services or congregation member, lit Hanukkah candles, and some less traditional, such as eating Jewish foods, talking about Jewish topics, and even the way that we asked about Shabbat. We asked the frequency in which people mark Shabbat in some way, because we know that some people choose to go to shul, other people choose to have pizza at the park, but regardless, many people in some way are setting aside that time of Shabbat as different, sacred, something special from the rest of the week. And that's what we were really most interested in. So depending on how they answered those 20 behaviors, they were statistically clustered into one of these groups. So nobody was asked, are you a holiday Jew? Right? They were asked those 20 different behaviors, and then these clusters came out of that. So what you see here is that you have almost a quarter that are minimally involved. And it's always hard to come up with the name of that group. But they really, being Jewish is not something that they express in any regular way through their behaviors. And then you have immersed, which are on the other extreme, where being Jewish and expressing that Jewishness is part of their daily, if not weekly, but often daily kind of routine. But one thing that I'd like you to take away from this is that we can no longer think about engagement as unengaged or engaged, as dichotomous. Because what you see here is that the ritual and the communal are both very engaged in Jewish life. They're just engaged differently. One is not better, one is not worse. We don't necessarily need or expect one to turn into the other. It's not a ladder anymore. It's really just different ways of expressing. So for those who ended up in the ritual group, they might mark Shabbat more. They might do more in the home. Whereas those in the communal group are the ones who are showing up to our organizations more invested in donating to Jewish organizations, those kinds of things. And in this report, there's a report on engagement. You can see in a lot more detail kind of how people responded based on which group they were clustered into. Okay, so congregational membership. I wish I would have asked you before I put this slide up what you thought the percent was for congregational membership. but it's 20%. So 1 out of every 5 said that they are part of a congregation, and there are no age differences in that group, which is pretty fascinating because you might expect, well, of course, young adults don't join groups anymore. They're not going to do that. But in fact, they answered the same statistically as any other age group. When you look at who's paying for membership, the younger group, the under 40, are a little bit less, but not so much. And part of that might be that our congregational membership numbers are so low to begin with that there just aren't age differences because 80% of our population are not members of congregations, regardless. So when you look at the right-hand table, you also see that it's interesting. I mean, even within the immersed, not everybody's a congregation member. So people are finding ways to connect and express their Jewishness that is not necessarily in congregations. And that's just a reality of the world, and one that our congregations are aware of. And that's why they are always striving to figure out how to meet people where they are and how to broaden their tent. So we looked at also different forms of rituals and Shabbat, as I said, marking Shabbat. And this also kind of went against what people thought in terms of young adult engagement. So young adults are really engaged in Jewish life. Like, we cannot say they are checked out. They are engaged in Jewish life, just not in the same traditional ways that we might have been. And so it's also interesting to look at the over 65, let's say, or over 75, and even for these very traditional kinds of ritual expression, the numbers, I imagine, could be higher. Then if you look at Shabbat, look how high the numbers are for weekly or almost weekly. So across the community, when we asked this question, 28% said that they mark Shabbat in some way, weekly or almost weekly. And when you look at the young adults, that's more than 1 out of every 3. I found that really optimistic. And that's partly why perhaps we have the success of programs like One Table, where you have Jewish adults, young Jewish adults, getting a little bit of money to host a Shabbat table. And it's something that has grown across the country. And part of that, I imagine, is because that's Jewish adults doing Shabbat on their own terms, in whatever expression that means for them. But it's setting aside that time for Shabbat. And what you see for the 75 plus is that it's 17%, right? Again, like, we need to understand more what's happening in terms of engagement for older adults and what needs are there and how might we be able to enhance that. And then we look at philanthropy, and we basically asked whether they gave at all, whether they gave to just Jewish organizations, just non-Jewish, or whether they gave to both. And here you see kind of the flip of the trend that we just saw in terms of ages, where, most people give something, right? But those who give to both Jewish and non-Jewish is less for young adults than it is for older adults. And hardly anyone is giving to Jewish only, which doesn't really seems fine, I think, that we give to a lot of different kinds of organizations. But what's curious is those who are giving to non-Jewish only. So they're not giving to the Jewish community at all. So that's what I have to share today, some highlights. I would love any questions or thoughts, anything that came to mind. Yes.
Less than 1.5%. And I know there were good organizations behind this, but I'm just calling into question a little bit the extrapolation of the responses from the 4,000 to get to 294,000 households.
Sure. So first of all, it's not a census. So everybody did not get a survey. There were randomly selected people to get a survey, and it was weighted based on, like, sometimes we had to sample more in certain areas, like in the South Bay, let's say, because we expected the response to be lower. So all of that was statistics that were done, and there were basically two groups. One was people who were part of organizations. And again, those we would expect to respond more than others. And then we specifically fielded surveys, chose families that were not part of any organizational lists that we were aware of. And what you get is an estimate of the population. So it's not in any way designed or meant to be a census, but it's the best statistical methods that we know of at this point to be able to get a representative sample.
So I have the mic for a second, so I'll ask a question.
Sure.
I didn't see flying by the statistics on marriages where one of the partners is not Jewish. Did you look at that, and was it in the data somewhere that you showed us? And the other thing is conversion. Did you ask that question or go into that number of people conversion?
Sure. So conversion we did ask. I do not have that number offhand. I don't know, Denise, do you happen to have that number offhand? I don't have that, but we can share that with you later if you're interested. In terms of interfaith, that's 42% is interfaith, which is the same as what Pew National Study found in 2020.
Thank you. This may not be critical, but if you're given the numbers of the people that you got the responses from and out of the total population, is there any potential bias to the fact that the people answered had a reason why they wanted to answer, as opposed to the other ones who said, "No, I'm not going to bother with this"?
I mean, look, there are biases in everything. What the statisticians tried to do was to be aware of those biases in advance that they could know of and to try and account for them. So for those who were not on Jewish organizational lists, they were actually sent an invitation in the mail that did not identify it as a Jewish study. It was called, I think, LA Speaks. And because the idea was that if they knew that it was a Jewish study, that it might bias their responses. So there were many things like that that were done to try and address whatever biases, in the same way that knowing that members of congregations, let's say, might be more likely to respond. So that was accounted for in the statistics in terms of how many people we looked for that were not in congregations, because we knew that they were not going to be as likely to respond. And obviously none of this is a perfect science, right? But these are the best estimates that, again, for the statisticians in terms of their advanced methodologies that they have at this point in time. Yes. I'm sorry? I can send Bill the presentation if you'd like, but there are, the actual studies are online at studyofjewishla.org.
You threw out that number 42% interfaith. Can you elaborate on what exactly that means? Is that at a household level, or 42% of the Jews are married to somebody who's non-Jewish? What does that mean?
Yeah, that got so confusing. The individual in the household, that was the couples, right? Or Jewish adults. It got really, really confusing, this part. Yeah, so the number of Jews that are married to somebody who is not Jewish.
And then one more that's kind of next door to that. I think it was like 21% of Jews are members of a congregation, if I remember right. And then I couldn't see very clearly, but there was a column that said Jewish, a column that said non-Jewish. Is that broken down at all between, again, a household that consists of 100% Jews versus a household that consists of one Jew, one non-Jew, that kind of thing?
Yeah, interfaith households are less likely to be members of congregations.
Can you wait for Mike? Sorry. I ask you to wait for Mike because the people on Zoom can't hear the questions. So.
I guess my question is, the Ezra study showed only about 600 plus people were being helped, and you document a huge need for help here. To what do you attribute the low numbers in the Ezra study?
So for the Ezra Network, we were looking at just 6 months of time, and those who participate in that particular program. There are thousands of others who go just to Jewish Family Services for other kinds of things, and Jewish Vocational Services and Beit Tzedek. But those were the numbers that came to the Ezra Network. But what I would say that I wasn't able to present today is that there are, I think it's about a third of people who seek social services are not getting them. So there are a lot of people who are seeking out support and for some reason are not getting them. And there are a lot of people who are seeking out support, but not within the Jewish community.
I guess the thrust of my question was, do you think that you need to spread the word about the Ezra Network? That
oh, absolutely. That's part of why we are here today. Yeah. But we're also going to be conducting a study in 2024 to really try and unpack what encourages people to seek out support. When are they comfortable seeking that from a Jewish institution? When are they not? What are the barriers? Are their needs being met? There's so much to unpack to really be able to address this monumental challenge in our community.
Shara, could you elaborate on the kinds of things that the young adults are doing Jewishly that keeps their engagement?
Sure. So if you think about just the Shabbat, we ask them whether they take a break from technology, whether they take a break from work, whether they are with friends, and all of those were pretty high in terms of Shabbat. They're also talking about Jewish topics more than other ages. They are keeping up with news, like a lot of the specific things that we asked them in terms of Jewish engagement that had nothing to do with organizations, their numbers were really high. So for instance, Federation has a program called New Roots that's focused on young adults, and they're just kicking off an Infinite Light celebration for Hanukkah, and we partner with a lot of different organizations. And I mean, there's everything from, a sound bath to a meditation walk to a text study to a celebration of Latino music. There are all different kinds of things that many young adults are finding resonate for them and are making a Jewish connection for them.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. It's impressive. Really impressive material. And the Ezra program sounds like it meets a real need here. So very, very interesting. So thank you for that.